Your position is being eliminated. Those 5 words echoed in Henry Wallace's mind as he sat quietly in the cold, sterile conference room at Stratwell Distribution in Kansas City. After 15 years of perfect forecasting, 15 years of helping this company avoid costly overstock, missed demand, and supply chain chaos, he was being dismissed like a forgotten spreadsheet. Across from him sat a young HR rep named Denise, nervously flipping through the pages of a manila folder. She couldn't meet his eyes. Behind her through the glass walls, Henry could see the warehouse floor, his warehouse. Every algorithm humming along in the background, keeping things balanced and efficient, was his doing. Effective immediately, she said with a rehearsed tone, "We've prepared a severance package for you." Henry didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply asked, "Who's handling forecasting now?" "Trevor Mills, our new VP of Operations," she replied, trying to sound confident. Henry knew the name. Fresh out of a tech-forward consulting firm, Trevor was all buzzwords and no track record. He had been circling departments like a hawk, muttering about automation and real-time dashboards, eager to make his mark. Henry nodded, stood up, and walked out with one cardboard box and a quiet sense of finality. But deep down, something told him this wasn't the end. It was the start of a storm Stratwell wasn't prepared to weather. As Henry stepped out into the Kansas City wind, his box tucked under one arm, the reality hadn't quite settled in. A coffee mug from his daughter, a picture of his late wife Linda, and a small desk cactus that somehow survived 8 years of missed waterings. Those were the only things that left with him. Everything else stayed behind: his algorithms, the models, and a forecasting system that had never once missed a quarterly target. Stratwell Distribution had been Henry's second home. He joined right out of college with a degree in supply chain management and a knack for seeing patterns others missed. The company, once a modest regional operation, had grown nationwide, largely thanks to Henry's meticulous forecasting that balanced inventory like clockwork through 3 recessions and a dozen market shifts. His first boss, Carl Jensen, had run forecasting with little more than intuition and a legal pad. Henry, however, spent late nights building spreadsheets that analyzed not just sales, but economic indicators, regional trends, competitor movement, and even gas prices. Carl had eventually admitted the kid was onto something. By the time Carl retired, Henry was running the department. And run it he did. Inventory turnover rose by over 30% in his first year. Dead stock slashed to under 2%. When the 2008 downturn hit, competitors dumped inventory at huge losses. Stratwell, thanks to Henry's foresight, barely flinched. After Linda passed away 4 years ago, work became more than a job. It became his anchor. The math never betrayed him. It didn't leave, didn't get sick, didn't change its mind. It gave him structure when the rest of his life unraveled. Over the years, he trained several junior analysts, mentoring them into roles at other firms where they still called him for advice. He wasn't flashy, never craved a corner office or a title, just results. But all of that didn't matter now. The company had changed. 8 months earlier, Stratwell had been acquired by a larger holding group with deep pockets and shallow patience. They brought in outside consultants, streamlined departments, and talked endlessly about agility and synergy. Trevor Mills was one of those consultants, young, smooth-talking, and always ready with a slide deck. He had impressed the new leadership with his jargon-laced vision for optimization. During his first meeting with Henry's team, he skimmed their models with visible disdain. "These systems are robust," Trevor had said with a forced smile, "but modern analytics relies on simpler, automated tools. Granular analysis is nice, but speed and adaptability matter more now." Henry had explained, calmly, how those complexities were what gave the models their power. How he tracked 17 different variables. How it wasn't guesswork, it was precision. Trevor nodded politely. 2 weeks later, restructuring began. Henry's department was the first to go. As Henry pulled into his driveway that evening, he didn't feel rage. What he felt was quiet concern. Concern for what Trevor would do with a system he didn't understand and clearly didn't value. Because when forecasting fails, it doesn't just affect numbers on a spreadsheet. It affects trucks, shelves, warehouses, and most importantly, people. And Henry had a gut feeling that the consequences were just getting started. 6 months passed. Henry spent his days consulting for a small regional distributor just outside of Topeka. It was easy work, clean datasets, modest operations, and a leadership team that still valued common sense over buzzwords. But no matter how much he buried himself in spreadsheets and projections, A part of him still glanced backward. Then, one Thursday afternoon in March, his phone rang. "Mr. Thomas, this is Blake Renner," came the voice on the line, measured, careful. "I'm the CEO at Stratwell Distribution. Do you have a moment?" Henry sat up straighter. In 15 years, the CEO had only ever called him directly during 3 events, once during a major supply chain disruption, once after a major client renegotiated pricing, and once to thank him for catching a predictive error that saved them $2.3 million. So this couldn't be casual. "I've got time," Henry said simply. "Did you, by any chance, prepare forecasting models for April through September before you left?" "Of course," Henry replied without hesitation. "I always work 2 quarters ahead. It's all on the shared drive, under Q2 to Q3 prelim forecasts." There was a pause on the other end. Not silence, just, "Wait. That's what I was afraid of," Blake said. Henry leaned back in his chair, his heart suddenly heavy. "We're sitting on almost $4 million in seasonal inventory," Blake explained. "Outdoor furniture, garden supplies, recreational gear." Trevor made aggressive purchases based on what he called post-pandemic consumer behavior trends. "The problem is, none of it is moving. Our warehouses are overflowing." Henry didn't respond right away. In his gut, he'd known something like this would happen. He had warned, in clear data and written recommendations, that consumer spending would retract due to economic uncertainty. His models had recommended a 20% reduction in seasonal inventory. "Do you still have your forecasts?" Blake asked. "I do. Full versions including methodology stored locally. Would you be willing to send them to me? I need to understand exactly what went wrong, and I suspect we ignored more than just a few spreadsheets." Henry agreed. After the call ended, he sat staring at his computer. Then, slowly, he began pulling the files together. Layered data sets, regression matrices, market simulations. All of it backed by 15 years of history-tested accuracy. By 4:17 p.m., he'd emailed the complete package to Blake with a brief message. "Attached are the preliminary forecasts for Q2 and Q3. I recommend reviewing the notes on seasonal volatility and discretionary spending behavior under economic stress. Let me know if further clarification is needed." Henry Thomas at 6:22 p.m., the phone rang again. "Henry," Blake's voice was tighter this time, "your models predicted exactly what's happening, down to the product categories. Trevor had access to these files, but I found internal emails where he called your methods outdated and needlessly conservative. He convinced the board to override your projections." Henry closed his eyes, not in anger, but in confirmation. The train wreck wasn't an accident. It was the result of arrogance. "Henry," Blake said, "would you consider coming in to explain your methodology to the board? They need to hear this. From you." Henry didn't answer right away, but one thing was certain: the silence around his expertise had finally run out. Henry spent the weekend preparing for the board meeting. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. This wasn't about vindication anymore. It was about showing what happens when seasoned insight gets discarded in favor of flashy credentials and shallow theories. His home office looked like a war room. Forecast models, seasonal performance breakdowns, comparative trend analysis. He compiled it all. Charts, reports, screenshots of procurement timelines, and even customer complaint logs forwarded by former colleagues. The evidence was overwhelming. But something unexpected happened Saturday morning. Jennifer Walsh, Henry's former assistant, called and asked to meet at a local diner. They hadn't spoken since the day he left Stratwell. She'd transferred to accounting after the restructuring. "Henry, I've got something you need to see," she said, sliding into the booth with a folder in hand. Inside were printouts, emails, and reports. "I pulled these before they scrubbed your files from the shared drive," she whispered. "Trevor didn't just ignore your forecasts. He buried them. Told the procurement team your methods were legacy thinking. Said anyone who referenced them would be reassigned." Henry blinked. "Wait, they deleted the models last month," she confirmed. "He claimed they were cluttering the system and confusing new hires." Jennifer continued. "Tony Vega, Phoenix warehouse manager, called me last week. Said inventories at 340% of normal levels. He raised the flag twice and got shut down both times. Trevor blocked all feedback meetings. Told the ops team that questioning his projections was a lack of faith and strategic vision." Henry took a breath. This wasn't just oversight anymore. This was a coordinated suppression of operational feedback and documented expertise. Back home, he reorganized the entire presentation. What had started as a technical demonstration was now a case study in systemic failure. By Sunday night, another call came in, this time from Tony Vega himself. "Henry, I heard you're presenting tomorrow," Tony said. "Just so you know, we've got our own report. Me, Carla in Memphis, and Don in Denver. We've got photos, emails, shipping logs, even customer complaints. We've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Henry smiled. "Tony, would you and the others be willing to share that with the board?" "We already compiled everything," Tony said. "We're ready." After the call, Henry stared at his screen. This wasn't just about $4 million in unsold outdoor furniture. This was about how experience had been silenced, about the risks of letting decision-making fall to people who never stepped onto the warehouse floor. Tomorrow wasn't just a presentation. It was a reckoning, and Henry Thomas, who'd once walked out quietly with a box of personal items, was about to walk back in with data, allies, and a story the board could no longer afford to ignore. Monday morning was cold and overcast when Henry Thomas arrived at Stratwell Distribution's corporate headquarters for the first time in 6 months. He wore the same Navy suit he'd worn to his late wife Claire's memorial, out of quiet symbolism, not sentimentality. Today wasn't just about business. It was about honoring truth in the work he'd built over 15 years. David Pierce, Stratwell's CEO, greeted him in the lobby. That alone was telling. During Henry's entire tenure, they'd rarely spoken directly. Now, David was walking him upstairs. "Henry, before we head in," David said as they stepped into the elevator, "Trevor will be in the room. He's asked to share his version of events. Also, the warehouse managers are joining remotely." Tony Vega insisted the board needs to hear the full story. Henry nodded. "They absolutely do." The boardroom was polished, professional, and tense. 7 board members sat quietly, folders open, eyes on the laptop Henry carried. Trevor Langston, in a tailored gray suit, sat at the far end, composed and ready. Henry didn't bother with small talk. "Good morning," he said simply, connecting his laptop to the projection screen. "Thank you for giving me the chance to walk you through the situation." The first slide showed his final forecasting models, built in February, weeks before his departure. They outlined a projected 15% drop in outdoor furniture demand, a 25% decline in seasonal sporting goods, and a significant rise in home improvement and small electronics demand due to tightening economic conditions. Then he flipped to the next slide, Stratwell's actual purchase orders under Trevor's leadership. Outdoor furniture had been tripled. Sporting goods had doubled. Electronics, ignored completely. Trevor adjusted in his chair. These models were outdated and didn't reflect emerging market behavior. "I used social trend analysis." Henry cut in calmly. "Social media trends are not reliable predictors of wholesale behavior. They are volatile, often misleading, and demographically inconsistent. That's why my model excludes them as a primary factor." He clicked again, revealing photos from Phoenix, Denver, and Memphis storage yards crammed with patio sets, unopened containers, and lawn equipment stacked in aisles meant for forklifts. Tony Vega's voice crackled through the speaker system, joined by 2 other warehouse managers. "For months," Tony said, "we tried to raise concerns, we sent reports, we asked questions. Everything was shut down. The outdoor inventory is 4 times higher than this season's average. Meanwhile, we're out of basic items customers are begging for." Chairwoman Eleanor Grant turned to Trevor. "You reviewed these forecasts before approving the purchases." "I did. But I determined they were too conservative. We had an opportunity to get ahead of the curve." Henry advanced to the final slide, customer complaints, lost retail accounts, and missed contracts. "If we'd followed the February forecasts," he said, "we'd be looking at over $1.5 million in profit. Instead, we're sitting on $4 million in stagnant inventory and broken client relationships." The room was silent. Then Eleanor leaned forward. "Trevor, please wait outside." Trevor gathered his notes and left, his polished demeanor finally cracked. Henry looked around the room, not smug, not gloating, just firm. "I didn't come here to point fingers," he said, "but facts matter, and ignoring experience comes at a cost." The reckoning had begun. As the boardroom door clicked shut behind Trevor Langston, the silence that followed was thick and telling. Henry Thomas stood calmly at the head of the table, hands resting on his laptop, eyes scanning the faces of the board. This wasn't just about correcting a failed strategy. It was about restoring faith in leadership, in process, and in the people who quietly held everything together. Chairwoman Eleanor Grant cleared her throat. Mr. Thomas, thank you for your clarity. The board has reviewed your models and heard testimony from warehouse management. It's apparent that a serious breakdown occurred under Mr. Langston's direction. David Pierce, the CEO, added, Henry, I want to be completely transparent. The board just voted unanimously to terminate Trevor Langston's employment, effective immediately. Additionally, we've instructed legal to begin reviewing his decisions for potential misconduct and negligence. Henry didn't flinch. He simply nodded once. Vindication wasn't his goal, but truth had a way of settling things. What we need now, Eleanor continued, is leadership, real leadership. Someone who not only understands the systems but who has the respect of those on the ground. Henry, we'd like to formally offer you the position of Vice President of Operations, with full authority over forecasting and inventory management. Henry let the offer hang in the air for a moment. It was the culmination of everything he had built: the models, the teams, the culture of accuracy and feedback that had been quietly erased by flashy jargon and ego. I appreciate the offer, he replied. But before I accept, I have two conditions. Of course, Eleanor said, leaning forward. First, Henry said, I want Jennifer Walsh reinstated as assistant manager of forecasting. She warned the team about what was coming, and she was sidelined for doing her job. David nodded immediately. Second, Henry continued, Tony Vega and the other warehouse leads who raised concerns. They need to be part of an ongoing operations council. Input from the ground floor should never be filtered out again. Eleanor smiled. We couldn't agree more. Then I accept, Henry said. The boardroom shifted in energy, not just relief but hope. In the weeks that followed, Henry moved quickly. He restored the original forecasting protocols, updated with refined variables to reflect post-pandemic behavior. Jennifer was brought back and promoted. Tony Vega was given oversight of national warehouse operations and helped implement a new communication framework, one where data flowed in all directions. As for the $4 million in unsellable furniture, Henry led a damage control strategy to liquidate the excess stock through regional discount chains, cutting losses to around 60%. Painful, but recoverable. Trevor, meanwhile, resurfaced at a private consulting firm in Chicago. Rumor had it he was advising on agile procurement strategies. Henry didn't waste time thinking about him. Instead, he printed and framed the final forecast email he'd sent before leaving Stratwell months earlier. The one that could have saved them millions if anyone had listened. He didn't hang it as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder. Experience isn't loud, but it's always right eventually. By the time Henry officially stepped into his new role as Vice President of Operations, Stratwell's leadership had seen enough fallout to finally understand what they'd lost when they let him go. But Henry wasn't interested in rehashing old mistakes. He was focused on rebuilding, not just systems and procedures, but trust. His first move was bold. He invited every warehouse manager, analyst, and regional operations lead to a company-wide strategy summit. For the first time in years, people who worked closest to the inventory, those who physically handled the products, managed storage space, and dealt with shipping bottlenecks, were seated at the same table as executives. It wasn't just symbolic. Henry made it clear, you're not just here to listen. You're here to speak. We don't move forward unless the front line is involved. Tony Vega, now Director of Warehouse Operations, presented the first segment. His team had created a detailed timeline showing the progression of overstock issues across facilities in Phoenix, Denver, and Memphis. Alongside each slide were photos of packed loading docks, customer complaint logs, and empty shelves where high-demand products should have been. It wasn't just a forecasting failure, Tony said. It was a communication blackout. We saw this coming, and no one upstairs listened. Jennifer Walsh followed, highlighting how critical forecasting files had been quietly deleted by Trevor under the excuse of server optimization. She showed how those files, had they been used, would have corrected course months earlier. Executives sat stunned, some visibly uncomfortable, others furious that such decisions had been made behind closed doors. Henry waited until the presentations ended before stepping forward. We can't undo what's been done, but we can make sure it never happens again. We're implementing a permanent cross-level operations review panel. Warehouse managers, forecasting analysts, and purchasing leads will have regular input on all strategic decisions. Period. It wasn't lip service. Within a month, every department at Stratwell was operating under new protocols. Forecasting models were cross-validated by at least 2 departments. All inventory decisions required sign-off from both data and operations. Feedback loops were installed and monitored, and the results came fast. With Henry's restored models, Strackwell drastically reduced unnecessary inventory in the next quarter and reallocated capital toward in-demand home improvement and electronics categories. Warehouse space stabilized. Client fulfillment rates improved by 18%. Lost accounts started returning. But perhaps more importantly, morale shifted. For the first time in years, employees felt seen. Their experience mattered again. At a town hall meeting in June, Henry stood before a packed auditorium and said, "We don't succeed because of trend lines and buzzwords. We succeed because people here know their jobs. And we've finally decided to listen again." A standing ovation followed. In the back of the room, Tony and Jennifer exchanged a look of quiet satisfaction. Vindication wasn't always loud. Sometimes it showed up in policy changes, re-earned trust, and a company finally listening to its own heartbeat again. And in that moment, Stratwell wasn't just recovering. It was becoming whole again. As Stratwell regained its footing, Henry knew the real healing came from restoring systems, not just operational but human. While policies and protocols were essential, the scars left by months of mismanagement wouldn't disappear overnight. Employees had been demoralized. Trust had been fractured. And the damage extended beyond unsold outdoor furniture and canceled contracts. It had seeped into the culture. So Henry launched what he called the Ops Truth Sessions. No suits, no filters. Just warehouse managers, analysts, logistics staff, and the folks on the ground, sharing what they saw, felt, and experienced. These weren't complaints. They were insights, raw and unvarnished. What emerged was eye-opening. Everyone, from Phoenix to Memphis, had tried to raise red flags. The system under Trevor hadn't just ignored them, it punished them. One of the most poignant moments came when a junior analyst named Mia stood up during a truth session and said, "I used to love working here. But when we saw the data going sideways, and were told not to bring it up again, it felt like we weren't employees, we were liabilities." The room fell silent. Henry didn't offer a corporate response. He didn't deflect. He simply said, "You're right. That's on us. That ends now." He followed up by creating a new insight protection clause in Stratwell's internal governance, a policy that guaranteed job security for any employee who raised operational concerns in good faith. Anonymous channels were set up. Regular cross-team audits were introduced. Transparency wasn't just encouraged, it was protected. Meanwhile, Henry worked closely with Tony Vega and Jennifer Walsh to reverse the most glaring gaps caused by Trevor's decisions. They launched an aggressive inventory rebalancing initiative, liquidating non-movers and redirecting budget to critical product categories that had been previously neglected. To everyone's surprise, by the end of the next fiscal quarter, Stratwell had not only stopped the bleeding, they had posted a modest profit. Even more telling was the renewed interest from major retail partners. Customers who had previously left due to inventory shortages began to return. One long-time client even wrote, "It feels like we're working with Stratwell again, not some tech startup with no grip on the ground." But perhaps the biggest shift was internal. Analysts once afraid to speak up were now running scenario reviews for the executive team. Warehouse managers who had been locked out of meetings were now sitting at the planning table. Henry had done more than rescue a broken forecasting system. He'd rebuilt the nerve center of the company. Late one evening, as Henry walked through the Kansas City distribution hub, he passed a break room where Tony, Jennifer, and a few others were laughing over takeout. The mood was light. The stress of the last year seemed to be lifting. He didn't interrupt. He just stood for a second, taking it in. This wasn't just recovery, it was redemption. Stratwell was no longer limping forward. It was moving with purpose, because its people were finally being heard. And in the quiet rhythm of forklifts and the hum of logistics, Henry knew they were building something better than before. By midsummer, Stratwell's board was no longer asking how things had gone so wrong. They were asking how things were getting better so fast. The shift hadn't come from flashy new tech or some miracle turnaround campaign. It came from consistency, accountability, and old-fashioned leadership, the kind Henry Mitchell had always believed in. Still, questions lingered about the broader impact of Trevor Collins' tenure. And as Stratwell stabilized internally, Henry felt it was time to finish what had begun in the boardroom, ensuring those responsible for the $4 million debacle faced the consequences. Working alongside David Kellerman, Stratwell's CEO, Henry submitted a formal report to the parent company outlining everything uncovered since his return. Jennifer Walsh's archived emails, Tony Vega's inventory logs, internal memos, even audio recordings from warehouse feedback meetings, all documented how Trevor had knowingly ignored, dismissed, and actively suppressed forecasting data. The evidence painted a clear picture. His decisions weren't just careless. They were willfully negligent. The parent company's legal team conducted their own audit. Within weeks, they confirmed what Henry had already proven. Trevor had violated internal protocol and failed to disclose material discrepancies in procurement strategies. He had misrepresented projections, blocked employee feedback, and overridden forecasting models without justification. Legal action followed swiftly. Trevor's consulting firm was notified of breach of fiduciary duty, and a civil suit for damages was filed on behalf of Stratwell. While the firm eventually settled out of court, part of the agreement included a public statement acknowledging professional misconduct and a financial restitution package that helped offset some of Stratwell's losses. Internally, the closure of the Trevor chapter gave everyone a collective exhale. But Henry wasn't interested in just slamming the door on the past. He wanted the company, and its people, to learn from it. At a town hall shortly after the legal settlement, Henry stood before a packed warehouse floor in Kansas City and said, "It's easy to blame one man. But the truth is, we let this happen because we got too quiet, too comfortable. Going forward, no one here is too junior to be heard, and no idea is too traditional to be respected." The room erupted in applause, not for revenge but for relief. 1 month later, Stratwell posted its highest customer satisfaction scores in 6 years. A major national retailer renewed its multi-million-dollar contract, and perhaps most telling, internal employee retention jumped by 18%. People weren't just staying, they believed in the direction again. Henry's next move: launching a mentorship initiative across departments to ensure institutional knowledge wasn't just preserved, it was passed on. Tony Vega was tapped to lead the operations training program. Jennifer was asked to head up the Analytics Innovation Council. And Henry, he returned to doing what he loved most: refining systems, mentoring new talent, and ensuring that the voice of experience was never again silenced in the name of modernization. Because when it came to running a company built on logistics, the most valuable thing Stratwell had wasn't data or dollars. It was wisdom, and the people who'd earned it. 2 weeks after the dust finally settled, Henry Mitchell stood once again in the quiet of his office, now his officially as Vice President of Operations. Sunlight poured in through the blinds, glinting off the whiteboard covered in forecasting notes and trend markers. He wasn't reflecting on his victory over Trevor Collins. No, what filled his mind was the photo he had just pinned to the corkboard, a worn snapshot of his late wife, Ellen, holding a coffee cup that read, "Data never lies." She used to tell him, "Experience is the only thing you can't download." It took a 4 million mistake for others to see what she always knew. Stratwell was back on track, yes, but more importantly, it was grounded again, and Henry, despite the title, still considered himself a teacher first, an analyst second, and a student of humility always. In a world chasing trends and quick wins, never underestimate the power of lived experience. Wisdom doesn't always wear a flashy badge, but when the storm hits, it's the steady hands that keep the ship afloat. Speak up, trust your craft, and never let anyone convince you that old school means obsolete. Have you ever been dismissed or overlooked because someone thought your way was outdated? Share your story in the comments. We read every one. If you found this story powerful, hit like, tap subscribe, and ring that for more true stories of quiet strength and well-earned victories. Behind every spreadsheet, there's a human story.